is so good to see you all here. I'm Devon, and I'm the product manager of the open source economy team at GitHub. And we run the GitHub Sponsors program and do a lot of other things for open source maintainers. And so I'm really thrilled to talk to you guys all today. So, yesterday, we announced that GitHub Sponsors, which, as a quick refresher, is a way to financially support the open source projects that you depend on. Yesterday, we announced that we are now able to support organizations to receive funding. So if your project likes to identify as a team, as a group of people, as opposed to just an individual developer, you can now receive funding as a group. So we're really excited about this. In that theme, today I'm going to talk to you about something a little bit more conceptual around how groups make decisions. For some background, before I started as a product manager, I used to be a developer, but then I took an interim period where I was doing independent research about open source communities, and I dove deep and spoke to hundreds of maintainers and contributors, and walked away with a lot of knowledge that I really am excited to share with you all today. One of the things that really kicked off my interest in this space is a good friend of mine named Nadia Egbal wrote a report in 2016 called Roads and Bridges. Roads and Bridges talks about how there's all of this unseen labor that open source maintainers do, that most of which goes unpaid and is on volunteer time. And I'm somebody who is really interested in cities and urban design and urban development, and I'm a big nerd about land use policy. So it really was very interesting for me to see Nadia talking about open source in terms of city infrastructure. That metaphor really struck me and pulled me in. So today, I'm going to combine my two interests, my love of cities and my love of open source, and share a little bit of the parallels that I see between them. So what we'll do is we're going to talk about 3 parallels and 1 really big difference. So as a quick rundown, we're going to talk about how cities and open source projects make decisions, how they secure funding, how they manage congestion, and when to define governance. So this is all very abstract. I promise I'll go in more detail as we go through the talk. So to start, both open source projects and cities have to make really difficult decisions that often affect a lot of different stakeholders who have different goals and different opinions about what should happen. So to start with cities, I think it's really interesting to look at this as one primary dimension around who gets the decision-making power. Is it a singular person? Is it a centralized source that gets to make one call? Or is it sort of more of a chaotic and maybe democratic thing where everyone gets a say, everyone gets to be part of the decision? And a very interesting instance of that first extreme is Paris. So Paris is one of the most beloved cities in the world. It is really famous for these beautiful boulevards that cut through the city. And the way that they got there was in medieval Europe. Paris was previously this warren of very small streets with no sewage. People were very sick all the time. It was incredibly difficult to get across the city because if you can imagine those little areas between the big boulevards, that was the entire map. And so if you wanted to cross the city, you had to go through this maze of little streets just to get anywhere. So during Napoleon III's reign, this is not Napoleon Bonaparte, but one of his sons, I think, he was an emperor. And so he got to say exactly what was going on. And he looked at his streets, and he looked at the people living in Paris and dying of cholera. And he said, you know what? We're not going to put up with this anymore. So he put a man in charge named Baron von Haussmann. And Baron von Haussmann was given basically complete reign over Paris. He could do whatever he wanted. And one could argue that he had a very good impact on Paris. They now have sewage. That's definitely a plus. They also have these boulevards to go through the city. But at the same time, to create those boulevards, he just sliced through the city with a red line and tore down entire neighborhoods. So I think this is an interesting image because you can see exactly where there were houses, there were businesses, there were community centers at every point where those roads now cut through. And von Haussmann just decided, you know what, it's for the greater good, we need to just cut right through. An interesting contrast is San Francisco, which we are all familiar with here. Here in San Francisco, we have a pretty serious housing crisis that I promise I won't rant to you about right now. But the long story short is that we don't build very much housing in San Francisco, and this makes the prices go way, way up. And a big part of the source of this problem is that every person in San Francisco gets to have a say as to what happens. There's this thing called discretionary review, which effectively means that any given person in San Francisco can say, you know what, I don't like that building. Let's not build it. And this makes it really hard to get anything done. So there's a very different sort of story here, and with a very different set of trade-offs. And I think in open source communities, you see very similar things. In open source communities, you have some extremes, like on Elm is a really interesting example of a programming language where there's a guy named Devon who just is really talented and has really strong opinions about what the project should be. And when he founded Elm, he very much set the tone that he said, you know, this is my thought baby, that I am going to make this my brainchild and do it the way I want, and I have this vision for what Elm will be. If you are with me, let's go. If you are not with me, that's fine, but you don't have to use Elm, but don't complain about it. JavaScript is on the opposite end of the spectrum, where JavaScript is much more community-driven. There's a committee that makes a lot of decisions about what goes in the formal language, and before even that, you can get some things inserted into Babel if you want to have your own little flavor of JavaScript. And this means that JavaScript it can be harder to make really major decisions that affect everybody, but it can also be easier to make smaller decisions and have little local experimentation. So to look at these trade-offs, I think in Elm, Devon has made some really hard choices. He's deprecated things. He's made certain parts of the language not backwards compatible because he's like, you know what? That thing that I built was a mistake. We're done. We're just not going to support this anymore. And it was extremely controversial when he did that. Whereas JavaScript has to be a lot more amenable to a lot of people when it makes those big decisions because it's affecting millions of developers all around the world. At the same time, it's quite hard to get that little experimentation inside of Elm because you have to get through Devon. And if he's not excited about it or if he's busy because he's one dude, it's just not going to happen. Whereas in JavaScript land, you can play with your own little flavor of JavaScript locally, play with it, share it with your friends, and if it catches on, then it could get adopted into the formal language over the course of years. So I don't really mean to say that one style is better than the other, and these are also sort of extremes, and there's a whole range of spectrum in the middle. But I think it's a really interesting way to think about open source communities. And when you're making the decision of what projects to adopt, it's one dimension that you should consider about which trade-offs that you want to take. So San Francisco ended up this way, and I personally think that we should, in the case of San Francisco, I personally think that we should sort of centralize a little bit more of the decision-making, just a little bit, because if any one of the 800,000 people who live here can say that a project can't happen, we're just not going to make any progress. However, the history of San Francisco's land use policy comes from a very real place that is quite similar to the von Haussmann situation. So in the mid-century, in the mid-1900s, America was not very responsive to certain groups. We did not really listen to the certain communities. And if you look at this highway map of some of which these highways were built, they just cut right through minority neighborhoods, and they were not listening at all to people. Luckily, before they built all of these highways and cut through the communities, San Franciscans stood up and said, you know what, we don't stand for this. We want our voices to be heard, and this is way too centralized in the planning department. We need to include more people in the community. So this is actually a lot of the history for why we ended up with the housing policy that we have, where any neighbor can say, I don't want this happening in my yard. And so I actually think it's a really hard balance to make, and there is no right answer here, because you are always going to either be going over people and saying, you know, we're going to just centralize this decision and not listen to you, and that's going to make some people mad. At the same time, you get stasis if you have to listen to every single stakeholder every single time. And so, again, I think this is a trade-off that communities have to make for themselves, and there is no right answer. And the more important thing is just knowing which set of trade-offs to expect when you go into a project. So this is sort of the result of these highway revolts, which caused people to not be able to build very much anymore. And so I think that the pendulum should swing a little bit more back to a slightly more centralization or slightly more representation, perhaps, as opposed to listening to every single person, because that creates a lot of misery as well. Okay, so how to secure funding. This is something that I think open source communities could learn a lot from certain cities. So in New York City, there's a crumbling subway station despite having millions of trips every single day. I think it's 6 million trips are made on the New York City subway every day. And yet they don't really take care of this infrastructure at all. Some of the people in this audience may see some parallels with certain projects in open source where we don't invest quite enough. By comparison, Hong Kong has this beautiful, shining MTR station. MTR is the company that runs the public company that runs the railroads in Hong Kong. And that contrast, just to go back to that slide, is just incredible to me. When I was in Hong Kong about a year ago, I was amazed by this great train system. And the way that Hong Kong does it is also the way that Singapore does it. They have this funding mechanism called value capture. And what that does is the railroad company actually owns the land around the stations. And so when they build a new station, it increases the value of the land all around it, right? If you could imagine if we were to add a new BART stop in some neighborhood, that would increase the value of all of the property there, because it's really it increases accessibility to the rest of the metro area. So Hong Kong owns this land, and then they rent it out, and so they actually make money when they create value, as opposed to just bearing all of the costs of that infrastructure. Because if you think about BART, if BART didn't exist, the entire metro region of San Francisco, of Oakland, of East Bay, all this stuff would be much, much lower, because we wouldn't all be able to coordinate with each other and collaborate and go visit your friend in Oakland. It's really just such a quick trip over that bay. Unfortunately, BART and the New York City subway don't actually capture any of the value that they create. They're sort of bearing all of the costs again and giving all of the benefits away to the community. And so I think that this is mostly a good thing, and we are able to fund some amount of infrastructure this way, but it's really missing a crucial piece, which is cycling that value back into the infrastructure, which is good for everybody. And so as a result, Hong Kong and Singapore have some of the best transit systems in the world, because they understand that they have to invest back into their infrastructure. So how does this relate back to open source? You guys are probably all sitting in the audience wondering why I keep going on about cities. So I think that open source projects should really start thinking about things in these terms, and the people who use those open source projects and the companies as well. Right now, we sort of see open source, a lot of people see open source as a freebie that we can just take, and we can take and take. But the problem is that if we don't put money back into that system, it's going to make it a lot harder to take things out of it in the future. And the best part of this is when you fund your infrastructure, you get a lot more value out than you ever put in. So I think that this is the mental model that we should have for thinking about infrastructure, much more than sort of the traditional route, which frankly is still born in US infrastructure systems that we are not investing back in. This is going to take time. New York City and San Francisco still haven't really figured this one out. It's the value capture model of Hong Kong and Singapore is still quite rare in the world, but it's growing in popularity. And so I'm just trying to evangelize it everywhere because I think it's the way we should think about all sorts of infrastructure, whether it's physical or digital. Okay, so a third thing we can talk about is how to manage congestion. So in cities, congestion looks like traffic, right? You get on the road and everyone's blocking you and things are moving slowly, the street is congested. In open source, congestion looks like opening a pull request or opening an issue and seeing that there are 500 more in front of you and that the maintainer is just super busy and does not have time to get to your issue or pull request, even if it's a super important one. In cities, the way that we manage congestion is through something called a congestion tax. In Singapore, again, I always go back to Singapore as a source of really interesting examples. In Singapore, they have this congestion tax that says every time you go on the road, every single mile that you go, you're going to get charged a small fee. Very, very, very small. But it's just because when you get on the road and you're complaining about traffic, you are also traffic. You are creating part of the problem. And so if you bear just a little bit of the cost that you are imposing on everybody else, then that causes people to only make trips that they actually have to make. It's interesting to contrast this to the way that issues work in GitHub or tickets work in Jira or all sorts of things like that, or message boards, where it's really, really cheap, if we put it in sort of money terms. It's really cheap to open an issue and create more work for somebody. All you have to do is be like, hey dude, this thing's broken. And then the maintainer's sitting there being like, okay, you didn't really give me ways to reproduce it. Like now I have to walk you through this whole process. It's frustrating. And maybe if it's a feature request that you've made, maybe you don't even care really about the feature, but now you've left the maintainer thinking all weekend about should I respond to this guy? It's kind of a dumb feature, but like I want to be polite. And you've created all of this work, and there's this really big imbalance between the amount of work created and the amount of effort that was actually put into opening it. So don't worry, we're not going to add a congestion tax to issues in GitHub. But I think that this is a very interesting thought experiment of like, what would a congestion tax look like? And I've already started seeing some open source maintainers playing with something that looks a bit like this. They say, basically, if you want me to guarantee you that I will close the issue, just send me $5 via PayPal. And I'm not sure if that's the best solution. I think that we could potentially do better than that, but I'm really excited to see people starting to experiment with this concept, and I think that we could learn a lot more from cities. But just to make everyone feel better that we haven't really seen a ton of experiments yet, again, most cities still don't do this, and that's why it's so hard to commute to work in the Bay Area. So a little bit of economics here to explain what's going on. So our standard model of fixed and marginal cost is this, right? If you're creating a factory that makes widgets, the fixed cost is the cost of creating the factory. And the marginal cost is every time you make a widget, how much more do you pay, right? It's useful to break this down a little bit into some subcategories. So the marginal cost includes the manufacturing cost, which can be like the materials, the cost of running the machines. There's the distribution cost, which is, you need to get the widgets to the people, and maybe you have trucks that are driving them to stores all over the place. There's the servicing cost. Let's say the widget, bites a kid's fingers off, and now his mom calls in and says, hey, my kid has a problem. Then you have to pay for all of the call centers that now service that thing. Open source and software, people usually think of having zero marginal cost. They think it's all fixed costs. You just do the development up front, and then you're good to go. And I think that this is the source of a lot of the misconceptions around funding open source and why we think that we don't need to fund it. Because you're like, well, the fixed cost is there, you just make copies, and yes, I would download a car if I could, kind of thing. This is sort of right. I think this does point to something that is really beautiful about software, where most of the investment does happen up front and then does scale immensely. But it misses something. So the manufacturing cost is basically zero. Copying bits is very cheap. Distribution cost is basically zero. You just go to the GitHub repo or download the tarball or whatever. But the servicing cost is not free. Every time someone opens a bug report, that imposes a cost on the maintainer or the developer, the community that is maintaining this work. And that is not seen for a very long time. It grows slowly enough that we think that it is zero, but it's actually not. And so over time, it can become extremely burdensome on the people if enough people are using their software. And I think this is the source of why a lot of maintainers don't get the sympathy that they deserve for the really hard work that they're doing. People think, oh, you just wrote the code, like, it's really not that bad, and don't you like writing code? But actually, the servicing cost is extremely high, not to mention dealing with the people problems that can come about from the earlier problems that we talked about around like making decisions and deciding what the funding is. So I would really like people to stop sharing the meme that software has zero marginal costs, because it's really not true. And I think it leads to a lot of bad behavior down the line that people understandably make. Like, I do think that it's an understandable misinterpretation, but we need to remember that there's that servicing cost that really does bear on people. So again, the way we deal with that cost, that the marginal cost in cities is the congestion tax. I think it would be really cool to start seeing people think about how to price that cost that is currently entirely being borne by maintainers. And I want to spread that around a little bit and make it so the whole community bears it. Okay, so those are 3 things that I think we can learn from cities. And I'm really excited to see more people experimenting with this over time. There's been really an explosion of people trying things like this, and I've incepted these ideas in enough people that some things have started happening. But there's something that we have very different between physical infrastructure and digital infrastructure. So here's a place where I want to change gears a little bit and say, we're going to have to figure this one out on our own. And that is when to define governance. So let's say I want to build a dam. If I want to build a dam, it is really hard to even get started. I have to get permits. I probably have to have a master's degree at least. So there's 3 years of my life. I have to go through environmental review. I have to go talk to all the communities. I have to raise a ton of capital. The list goes on before you're even starting to lay the first rounds of cement. And so what this means is that there's a really high barrier to entry for building something like a dam or any other physical infrastructure. One of us cannot just walk out there and be like, you know what, I want to build a new highway today. No, that's not an option. By contrast, starting a new open source project is really easy. All you have to do is go to GitHub, create a new repository, and there you go, you have an open source project. Maybe no one's using it, and maybe it's totally useless, but you can start and there's no one stopping you. This is one of the most beautiful things about open source. It's one of the reasons why we get so much innovation. Really talented people who maybe society doesn't necessarily respect or overlooks a little bit can just go in and be like, I have this really cool idea. I want to share it with my friends. And then oftentimes it'll just take off from there because what they've built is so amazing. So this is one of the best things about open source. It is also the source of some of the biggest challenges of open source. And what I mean by that is that open source developers often start projects without really having a very long-term plan for what it'll be, because they're just hacking away on a Friday night, eating their pizza with their friends or whatever, maybe at a hackathon, and they don't necessarily even know what it'll be in a week, let alone in 3 years or 5 years. So a very, very often story that I hear from amazing open source maintainers is that they've started this project, it was solving problems for their friends, and then suddenly all these people just started joining the party and opening pull requests and opening issues. And at first it was really exciting. But then it started getting really, really overwhelming because people just started pouring in, and they're like, I really never expected any of this to happen. And the result is that it's really stressful because you've kind of never put the boundaries in place of what it is that you want your open source project to be. You've never really defined what is and is not the community, who does get to decide rules, who doesn't. If you start receiving funding, who gets the money? I can't tell you how many open source projects I know of who are raising money, but as soon as they have the money, it just sits in a bank account because they're like, who do we actually allocate this to? This is really hard now. We didn't really think about this yet. And so this is one place where I think we can provide a lot better education and setting those norms and also making it easier to learn from other people. And so because a lot of open source work is effectively all remote work, people don't necessarily have really strong mentors that they can learn from, people who can tell them, this is the way I did it. This is how we solved our problems. And so one of the things I've been trying to do during my time here at GitHub is create more spaces for open source developers to talk to each other and to learn from each other, because people have really figured out a lot of really cool things, and it's just a question of sharing those. And I think it's also important to point this out that when you get to the point where you're feeling overwhelmed with an open source project, you should just start to think about, okay, what structure should I be putting in place now that it's big? And I think it's cool because it means that we get to lazy load governance. It means that with a dam, you have to decide governance and make all these decisions up front. Now we only get to decide if the project's actually working. But the thing is, when the project is actually working, you do need to decide these questions. You do need to nail these down, because otherwise you will be completely overwhelmed with work and with really hard ethical questions even. Okay, so that was sort of a whirlwind through my two obsessions, which are cities and open source. And I would love to talk about these basically without any end whatsoever. But I also want to leave you guys some time to ask questions about GitHub sponsors, about how GitHub thinks about open source, about any of the research that I've done, or about cities too, if you are interested. So I will leave you with just one story that I think I find really hopeful, but you might find kind of gross. In Japan, as late as I think the 1950s, they didn't have sewage in most major cities. So if you've ever been to Tokyo, imagine Tokyo with no sewage system. Not a pretty sight. If you look at those barrels there sitting on the sidewalk, you can guess what those are filled with. And if you go to Tokyo today, it is a sparkling clean city. It smells great. It doesn't smell bad, at least. And they've really solved this problem. And so while I think every once in a while I get a little down about how little we are funding open source and how little support maintainers have, but we are not in this bad of a situation. We are not literally, I'm actually not going to go there. But the point is, we can make progress really quickly. It only took about a decade or two for them to fully replace all of this infrastructure and solve these problems. And they did it not a very von Haussmann style. They did it without disrupting a ton of people's lives because they had better technology and they were more thoughtful. So I like this picture because it reminds me that we can make progress quickly. We can do a lot, even when it seems like a very desperate situation. And so I'm really excited to see more experiments, encourage more experiments, and try new things out inside of the GitHub product, too. So if you guys have any ideas, please let me know. I think, this is their new sewage system. It works a lot better. If you have any ideas whatsoever, please email me at the email that is really small on the screen right now. Or send me a DM on Twitter, or just reach out to me on GitHub. So thanks. So looking at the timer that I'm left here, I have about 10 minutes for Q&A. If you have any questions whatsoever, let me know. And I think we have microphones. Yes.
Hey, so this is on the city side of things. Have you heard of opportunity zones, and do you have a take on them?
Yeah. So I read about them a while ago, and I had a take. I need to just remember what it was. That would probably be better. I take a lot of notes, so it's written down somewhere in my external brain, but it's not in my real brain. Yeah.
Hi, Devon. How did your interest in cities inspire the mechanics of GitHub sponsors?
Yeah, so it really is what got me into it all in the first place, and actually how I met Nat, the CEO of GitHub. I'm very involved in housing policy in San Francisco, and he is too. And so we didn't even talk about software for the first year that we knew each other. I didn't really know that he had any technical background. We were just talking about cities and yelling about city planning meetings and things like that. And it really inspired the whole project, actually. So this is a little bit abstract, but I think it's useful still. I'm a really big believer that coordination problems are some of the biggest problems in the world. And a coordination problem is, if you guys are familiar with prisoners' dilemmas or tragedies of the commons, this idea of two people or multiple people who, when they act in their own best self-interest, they do things that are worse for all of them. I think those are some of the worst problems in the world. A prime example of this being global warming, right, where everyone doesn't want the planet to melt. I think we're all on the same page with that. But at the same time, every time you get in the shower, you just want to leave it on a little bit longer, or you want to buy that new thing that comes in a big plastic wrap, or it's a little bit more efficient to take an Uber than to bike, so I'm going to do that. But if we all do that, then it adds up and it screws us all. So I think the way that we are not really funding open source at the moment is the same kind of problem, where we would all be better off if our digital infrastructure was great and we could all use it without a hitch and it was well maintained over the long term. But no one really wants to be the person who actually foots the bill. And so I was originally spending a lot of my time thinking about these problems in the city context, but frankly, I felt a little bit powerless because I was just a software engineer who had a lot of opinions, but no real knowledge about how city governments worked, and I felt like I wasn't making very much progress. And once Nadia's report about roads and bridges sort of connected the dots for me, making me realize, oh, we're seeing the same problems in open source, I thought, I can make a much bigger impact there. As a software engineer myself, I understand how this stuff works. I know the people involved. I can do things here. And then when Nat became the CEO, I sent him a very long email being like, you guys should do something about open source. And then he emailed me back saying, you should do something about open source. Come join GitHub. So there's a very, very strong thread between those. And in my brain, I cannot separate them at all.
You mentioned briefly talking about sponsorships, and I know that GitHub offers, encourages open source projects to get sponsorships. What's the minimum entry requirement? In other words, do you have to be registered as a nonprofit to be supported that way, or just an individual developer, or what?
The minimum requirement is to have a GitHub account and to not be abusive on the platform. GitHub has a really strong product philosophy of creating a canvas for developers to do things on, and we don't really want to define what people do as long as it's within the bounds of a respectful community. So we don't want to pick winners, and we invite everyone to get sponsored through GitHub sponsors. I can say, if we were picking winners, we would not have chosen certain projects that we just didn't know about. So it's really important for us to leave it as open as possible to everybody.
Hey, I'm a big fan of yours. I think that this is a fantastic talk, and I'm super grateful for the Sponsors Project. I'd like to know what you think as far as the role that GitHub has in the funding and sustainability of open source. To what extent do they feel it's a responsibility and an obligation versus just something that we should do?
Responsibility and obligation on the part of GitHub, or so GitHub would be nothing without open source. Developers are the core of the GitHub community, and it's why people come to GitHub. I think actually an interesting metaphor here is like Twitch or YouTube. So Twitch and YouTube have a very small portion of the user bases that are streamers or video creators, but if they didn't upload content, like no one would want to come to that community at all. I think that's where the parallels end. There's other things that are not similar. But I think once you frame it as that, where it's like maintainers are what make GitHub what it is, then it's just obvious good business sense for GitHub to be doing this. So that's one thing. I think like it's just out of like almost economic self-interest. It's a great idea to do this, and I think I'm very excited for GitHub to be taking this on for that reason. And it's also one of the reasons why I thought GitHub was a good place, because it's not just a question of sort of charity or just out of being like a good company, but it's actually something that is sustained for the long term because it's really necessary for the long-term health of the whole ecosystem. On the other hand, I'm doing this because I think that GitHub also has sort of an obligation. GitHub, again, would be nothing. And so it's very important to give back to that community because they've done so much for GitHub and for all of the companies that use software that I think it's a big thing. But that said, I don't think GitHub's the only one that has the obligation. I think every company that uses open source has an obligation here, every developer who uses open source. And so I think we're starting to see a cultural change where people are starting to recognize this. But it's been happening kind of slowly over the last few years. So yes to both.
Hi.
Hi.
To extend the digital infrastructure metaphor and kind of looking at city infrastructure the way that you were looking at it, there's a border in there somewhere where it stops being city infrastructure and starts being the plumbing in your house. And when we look at the way companies tend to fund open source projects, that line is very blurry. And I wanted to hear kind of how you think about that particular aspect of the problem.
That's an interesting extension of metaphor. I think this is one of the places where I think it creates a lot of the tension that we start seeing in issues. We've probably all seen those flame war issue threads that happen. And I think one of the sources of tension here is that companies understandably want this open source to be as useful as possible to them. But the maintainers say, hey, dude, this is my roadmap. And also, I'm not going to just go do some boring integration work for you for free. That's not going to happen. And so there's this mismatch of expectations because companies think, oh, wait, why doesn't the maintainer want this to be as useful to everyone as possible? And the maintainer thinks, why does this company feel entitled to my time? Both very understandable reactions. And so one of the things that I think can smooth that over is if the company says, hey, we will pay you to do this. We are excited to use the software. We just need it to be tweaks. In this way, we need a wrapper around it to make it more useful. Here's some cash to make that happen. And so that can align the incentives where the maintainer is saying, okay, I am happy to do some of this custom work. It's not really what I'm personally most excited to do in the core of the project, but it's a way to make it a little bit more useful to more people. Maybe it'll also be useful to the rest of the community. Some people will, have to have this particular integration too. I'll make that happen. So I think money can sort of make that simpler. I do want to note that it can also create risks where it could potentially sort of change the roadmap, and it's not just about changing just a wrapper, but maybe it changes some part of the core library. And I think that's something that we have to be very careful of. So this is one of the reasons we've been rolling out GitHub sponsors very slowly, is because while I believe very strongly that we should be funding open source, we cannot make this change too quickly because, like we learned in Paris, it ruins people's lives. No, I mean, if you completely change the paradigm of the way something is done, it can create a lot of problems, even if the old paradigm was kind of broken. So that's one of the things I'm keeping an eye out for, is making sure that it is actually a question of doing just some custom work on the edge of the project that helps the company without sort of screwing up the entire project. And I try to have a call with a maintainer every single day who's in the program just to make sure that that isn't happening and sort of keeping an eye on things. Okay. I think we have one more question. We have 1 more minute according to my clock, and then we can wrap up.
Hey, thanks. You mentioned in the talk about governance, and definitely when you get the money coming into a project, you have the governance question of how to spend it.
Yeah.
Does GitHub have plans to provide support or training or materials to help new projects or projects that are growing, I don't know, adopt best practices or help them find the model that works for them?
That's a good question. So right now, the answer is just me. It's not really a formal thing, but anytime a maintainer wants to talk about that stuff, I am more than happy to talk about it and give input. And I really have a cool job because I get to talk to all of these different people and sort of share the best practices across them. So while I don't think I don't personally have all the answers that I've created myself, I've collected a lot of really good answers from other people. That's not scalable though. Unfortunately, I don't have a cloning machine, not yet. Someone hopefully builds an open source version of that at some point soon. But I think that's something that we could do better at. I also think that best practices are not very well defined right now. Often my advice comes in the form of, here's a menu, and this is what I think the consequences are of different options, but I don't really know. Here you go. But as we're learning more through this program and as we sort of collect a set of options, I think best practices will continue to sort of rise to the top. And I'm excited to see that happen. So long story short, we don't have anything like that right now. I think it's something we can and should build in the future, but I want to hold off until we have better answers, because what's worse than no advice is bad advice. So we want to be careful there. Great, thank you all. I'll be hanging around here. Thanks.